had ethical lapses in both our medical school and in our athletics program. The university investigated those problems, learned from those mistakes, corrected them, and as a result became a stronger and better place. In many dimensions, in enrollment, faculty size, research, and operation budgets, we are not so different from Penn State. The scope and size of our intercollegiate athletics operations are also similar. But I assure you we are in a very different place in our evolution as an institution. We are a mature, professional, administratively strong organization and a place that is very mindful of maintaining a culture of compliance and that is structured with the necessary checks and balances. Needless to say, I am committed to the protection of children on our campuses and to improving our culture, policies, and processes to maintain and guarantee this goal. And I know you, as a Board of Regents, join with me in that commitment to protect children when they come to our campuses to learn and to grow. So I think most of you know the facts up on the slides in front of you now. Between November of 2011 and June of this year, Sandusky was charged with 48 counts of sexual child assault and found guilty by a jury on 45 of those counts. The president, Graham Spanier, was forced to resign. The football coach, Joe Paterno, was fired. The athletic director was put on administrative leave and remains there. The chief financial officer quit. And the Penn State Board of Trustees hired Free's firm to investigate the entire episode. The investigators were given total independence and access to all Penn State personnel and documents. In July, Free released his report. He found that the president, the senior vice president of finance, the athletic director, and the head football coach had, and the quote is, repeatedly concealed critical facts relating to Sandusky's child abuse from the authorities, the university's board of trustees, the Penn State community, and the public at large. And the report found, bluntly, total and consistent disregard by the most senior leaders at Penn State for the safety and welfare of Sandusky's child victims. He added to that, unchecked by the Board of Trustees that did not perform its oversight duties. Sandusky, as I mentioned, was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. In response, the NCAA weighed in. Penn State's football program was penalized with a 4-year prohibition against postseason play, with the loss of scholarships, with the vacating of past wins, and with a $60 million fine. So what can we learn from Free's report and recommendations? I want to focus on his key observations: a failure of leadership at the highest levels, a culture that valued image and reputation above the safety of children, a culture that allowed the athletic program to exist outside university norms, an absence of accountability by senior leaders to the Board of Trustees, the absence of board engagement, and a weak and underdeveloped organizational structure. But Madam Chair and Regents, this scandal involved people with jobs and responsibilities much like ours at a university that is similar in size and scope. Free provided more than 100 recommendations in 7 categories, plus recommendations on measuring change and monitoring improvement. I find many of those recommendations to be specific to the Penn State structure, but approximately half of Free's recommendations are already in place at Minnesota, and another third of our policies and practices are at least partially aligned with his recommendations. The remainder, we believe, are not applicable to our organizational structure and circumstances. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We need policies, process, and governance structures that fit us, and I am confident that we have a system that would have detected and reported the Sandusky crimes early on. The opportunity here is for us to examine all that we do to be sure we are protecting children who come to our campus for many, many different reasons. Now, rather than detail his many recommendations one by one, I will focus our discussion on 4 important areas, and they are listed here on your slide. Creating and managing a culture of compliance. For this group to understand and deliver on its responsibility and oversight role, to ensure an administrative structure that is needed, and the overarching goal of protecting children on our campuses. So those will guide our discussion. Now, according to the Free Report, many cultural and administrative deficiencies at Penn State enabled the behavior that led to the cover-up for years of the sexual abuse of children. At the University of Minnesota, virtually all of Free's recommendations in these areas are addressed. Unlike Penn State, At Minnesota, we have an institutional compliance officer, a well-established and robust Office of General Counsel with an independent representative to the board, the General Counsel, a Vice President for Human Resources, something that Penn State did not have, an independent internal auditor, and a fully staffed athletics compliance office that is independent from the athletics department. Our codes of conduct emphasize the university's commitment to integrity, ethical conduct, and maintaining a culture of compliance. They go far beyond athletics or children. They encompass our guiding principles and values, our standards of conduct, including managing conflicts of interest, teaching and research obligations, business interactions, and stewardship. In those ways, we are different from Penn State. And in addition, we have a strong culture of compliance with clear compliance responsibilities assigned to our senior leadership team. We also have a culture of compliance with regard to federal law. Free discusses in great detail Penn State's failure to comply with the Clery Act. The Clery Act, which was created in 1990, has as its purpose to ensure that students and their families have official crime statistics available to assist them in making choices of where to live or where to attend school. It also requires colleges and universities to issue timely warnings when crimes represent an ongoing threat to safety, to maintain and publish campus safety and security policies, including emergency, missing student, and fire safety policies, to maintain crime and fire logs, and to publish and distribute an annual security report containing policies and crime statistics. Now, we examined our compliance with the Clery Act across all of our campuses earlier this year, and we found that we do a very good job complying. We found strong compliance with reporting the crime statistics to the federal government on all of our campuses. However, while we do an excellent job reporting on the Twin Cities campus, our processes for sharing those reports broadly with students and family were not standardized across all of our campuses. And as a result of our review, we've made improvements to standardize and strengthen our compliance process with the Clery Act across all campuses. To do that, we established a template annual security report to use on each campus. We provided a master list of campus security authorities, or CSAs, which each campus will tailor to fit its circumstances. CSAs are the employees responsible for providing the Clery crime reports and include police, housing, student conduct officers, coaches, and the athletic director, faculty advisors of student groups, and others. And we're now providing template letters to CSAs to request all crime reports. We've implemented web-based training for CSAs, and later today in the Facilities Committee, Vice President Wheelock, Chief Hessness, and others will be providing an in-depth report on public safety at the university. As a result of our own experiences here, we have a vigorous structure to address NCAA compliance. As a board, you delegate authority to the president to oversee athletics. You own an important governance role, and as a result of Board of Regents policy on intercollegiate athletics, we are diligent in reporting violations. We have a strong management culture within intercollegiate athletics. University offices educate about, monitor, investigate, and enforce NCAA and other conference rules. It's important to know that the Athletic Compliance Office reports to the Office of General Counsel, not to the athletic director, in order to maintain independence and avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. The model's been in place for more than a decade on the Twin Cities campus and recently adopted at UMD. We have what is known as a thick file at the NCAA. We report violations of NCAA rules, no matter how apparently trivial they may be. That indicates to me a culture of compliance. We've not had a major NCAA violation in a decade. Many well-known schools do not have thick files at the NCAA. They report a suspiciously small number of violations. Of course, a strong and independent compliance function would not be effective without a strong athletics director to help carry the message and to be accountable with the outcomes. Let me give you some examples of the types of relatively minor NCAA secondary violations we diligently report. Some of these are quite remarkable, and they say more, frankly, about the NCAA rule set than about our behavior. We reported that a student athlete tweeted about 2 recruits on 2 consecutive days. One of the recruits had verbally committed to the U, and the student athlete thought that was permissible, and the post was taken down. We reported that, in violations of NCAA rules, a coach called a prospect 2 times in 1 week. The coach was prohibited from calling the prospect for 2 weeks. We reported that we inadvertently paid $9.95 for internet service during a prospect campus visit and stay at a hotel. We issued the coach a letter of admonishment and required the prospect to repay the amount, actually to a charity of her choice. This item will be included in further future compliance education training sessions. That's the level of detail of NCAA rules, but I'm proud of the fact we have not had a major NCAA violation in more than a decade. Now, as you know, we have a strong code of conduct policy for the Board of Regents. First adopted in 1996 and twice amended, it emphasizes the university's commitment to integrity, ethical conduct, and maintaining a culture of compliance. And of course, you are appointed by our legislature after a rigorous screening process in which your duties and responsibilities are thoroughly discussed. Penn State is different. Penn State has a 32-member board of trustees, and it is composed of the following: 5 trustees who serve in an ex officio capacity by virtue of their position within the university or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, including the governor and some state commissioners. 6 trustees appointed by the governor, 9 trustees elected by the alumni, 6 elected by organized agricultural societies within the Commonwealth, and 6 elected by the Board of Trustees representing business and industry endeavors. My opinion, my personal opinion, is that that is an unwieldy board structure. It's worthwhile in keeping this board structure in mind when realizing Freeh's criticism of the Penn State Board. He points out that the board's failing in its duty of oversight and to reasonably inquire about and require detailed information from its president. The board oversight recommendation and Freeh's report are very consistent with our practices here at the University of Minnesota, and they stress transparency. They focus on strong, independent lines of communication, both with senior leaders, but also with the broader university committee. And they focus on ensuring board members have information about organizational compliance, reporting, and crimes on campus, among other risks. In my view, the communication and relationship between the University of Minnesota administration and this Board of Regents is regular, robust, and well-developed, and I hope you agree. You have an audit committee, a litigation review committee, and regular briefings for board leadership on legal and compliance matters, as well as risk. The oversight level is appropriate, and we address difficulties directly as they arise. However, this is quintessentially the board's responsibility to judge the correct level of information and oversight. Like Penn State's board, you have a responsibility to ask questions and to be as informed as possible. Freeh did make one recommendation that can apply to us. That is, to conduct an informational session with the board on Clery Act compliance and reporting. And as I noted earlier, while we do have strong compliance in this area, such a session could be readily accomplished if the board wishes to hold one. Let me add one other note. Just Tuesday, the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, or AGB, released a report titled Trust, Accountability, and Integrity, Board Responsibilities for Intercollegiate Athletics. It calls nationally for enhanced board oversight of college athletics. We were one of 143 institutions that participated in the surveys that helped to develop the AGB report, and the report cautions that as intercollegiate athletics departments increasingly operate like businesses, boards must act to ensure an appropriate balance between athletics and academics on their institutions. They continue, or policymakers or regulators will do it for us. Regent Allen is a member of the AGB's Intercollegiate Athletics Project Advisory Group, and Regent Allen, I thank you for your important work on that board, and I'll ask you to add some comments at the end of mine, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. If you were to look at the membership of that advisory group, you would easily find that I was clearly the rookie in the group. And so my first reaction when asked to serve on there was to say to the university, here, help. And consequently, I sat down with a whole group from the athletic department, from the president's office, and what have you, and outlined a whole list of things I didn't think I knew much about. And I want to say thank you for all the help. I asked one question of one of those people, and I thought it was a simple question. I got a 3-ring binder about that thick with from some of his previous work, and I thank him particularly for that. So that really tells you something about this university. I think the president has said that we are in pretty good shape, and I want to say more about that later. There were some 300 universities and colleges in the Division I group that were asked to respond. As the president said, about 143 did, 42%. They covered their gamut from private to public and research universities and smaller groups. It was a good cross-section. It strikes me that many of the things the president just covered are recommendations in this report from the AGB. First of all, there are 2 key elements, I think, that are required to be sure we prevent problems here. Number 1, you have to create a culture of compliance from the top down. From this board on down to every individual employee, it has to be clearly understood that this university is responsible and that the board is particularly responsible, but every individual up and down the line is responsible. You wonder what would have happened at Penn State if one individual earlier on in the process had said, wait a minute, this university stands for something different. I need to say something to somebody and get something done about this. You need to have that culture of compliance, and you need to have the mechanisms by which somebody who recognizes that culture of compliance feels they can report an issue that needs to be brought to light. We have many of the institutional mechanisms in place, the audit committee, compliance. We have many, many people who are independent of the athletic department who are involved with it closely enough to know what's going on. So I think we have a very good system here. And I was very pleased throughout the process to be able to say, gee, I think we're doing things right and that we comply with a lot of the recommendations of the group, if not in specifics, at least in substance. It strikes me that one of the key items that has to be looked at is whether or not boards and presidents know how to work together on this issue. The report from the AGB is very clear. It says on page 3, we are not urging boards to move into areas of management. The AGB earlier statements on athletics make it clear that our recommendations about the ideal breadth and limitations of board engagement do not intend to move into the prerogative of what is the president's. Yet at the same time, we have to know enough about it to know that what is happening from the president on down does indeed meet the criteria that have been set out. I think we do that pretty well, but we ought to always ask ourselves the question of whether or not we can do it better. It really comes down to that commitment of the culture that we want to set. You know, sports in this country are clearly a very, very large endeavor. You can argue that issue philosophically as a society, but in fact, we are at a certain point, and it's very large. For example, in the years from 2005 to 2008, for the football bowl series institutions, academic expenditures per capita, per student, rose about 20%. Expenditures for athletes rose almost double that amount, about 38%. It says something about the priorities of the society and where we're at. But it clearly says it's big business, and it's clearly a huge part of our academic institutions, and it bears a lot of attention. I don't need to repeat what the President has said about the mechanisms we have at this institution. They follow already many of the recommendations in this report from the AGB. They follow many of the recommendations that are in the Free report. And frankly, we are in pretty good shape. And that is a strength. But it is also a great danger. We are in good enough shape so that we could say, gee, we can rest kind of easy. And that would be the worst thing in the world that could happen. We need to make sure that we are always reviewing the procedures and mechanisms we have in place. We need to look for new ones that need to be put in place. And we need to always be aware that without that culture of compliance and that attention to the detail, we could have the same kind of problem. I don't think we will, but we better pay attention to it. And that's what this report is all about. I hope many of you will read this report from the AGB. It has a lot of recommendations. There are different ways of implementing those at different institutions. I will simply close with one remark. I think the President's office and the Chair would probably agree that the survey they were asked to complete, which underlies the basis of the AGB report, was a very comprehensive survey. It is indeed a survey that probably cannot be filled out by one person, but it is a good index of what we ought to be looking at in order to be sure that this institution is indeed watching over the enterprise as it should. The good news here is that we had an awful lot of people who were able to help with the preparation of those reports, and that's a lesson. It takes everyone up and down the line working on this to be sure that we remain in good condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Allen. Let me conclude with a few additional observations. First, about Penn State's administrative structures. They appear to have grown up organically over time, and as we know now, we're not as mature as effective as needed. The Free recommendations largely focus on best management practices, records retention, hiring practices, operational effectiveness and efficiency, effectiveness of search processes, and setting compensation. We have begun to work on one area that was called out in particular, and that is to have functions report centrally in order to have not only more compliance with the institutional processes, practices, policies, and rules, but to provide operational excellence in what they do. And this aligns with the recent dotted line reporting decision for IT, HR, and other components of the university, which is exactly designed to bring a university-wide and enterprise-wide effectiveness on highly distributed operations. Finally, let me move to the fundamental issue here, which is protecting children. It is a significant focus of the Penn State report and a critical area for us to review carefully. We have thousands of children who visit our campuses every year. The university professionals who lead programs for children and minors are aware of the need for protecting the safety and security of children. The university does not have a history of sexual assault reports against children on any of our campuses. While we do a significant amount to educate employees about their obligations under university policy and law and require them to report crimes or suspected crimes against children, we must do all that we can. We do follow university and policy and state law and reporting, but as Regent Allen has indicated, we must remain vigilant. In response to the Penn State scandal, we conducted training and awareness with senior leaders and athletics department personnel. That training emphasized that any university employee who is aware of or a witness to the abuse or neglect of a child is expected to report it to law enforcement immediately. Our programs for children are decentralized and varied in terms of size, scope, time of year, duration, and sponsors. Standardizing our practices and ensuring that everyone who hosts children on campus is aware of them is complex, but we must and will ensure children's safety. And to that end, I will convene an ad hoc committee to review and develop as needed new system-wide policies for the safety and protection of children on our campuses. The committee will determine whether additional operational changes are needed. And it's my expectation that we will present that policy to you well before the end of the academic year. I have two closing observations. One is cautionary and the other is prospective. No university, including this one, is immune from lapses of judgment, disregard for accountability, or the irresponsible actions of individuals. What we can do is have in place appropriate administrative offices, policies, and educational programs to ensure against these events. In my view, we have those structures in place as a result of our planning and interactions with this board. But we must remain alert and, as Regent Allen suggested, humble. We must keep each other on our toes and remain committed to the principles of ethics and integrity. You as a board must feel free to question me and other leaders and be confident that you receive candid answers. Free's report found that Penn State leaders supported a culture that appeared to value the image and reputation of athletics above the safety of children. Clearly, that's unacceptable, and we can never allow that to seep into the University of Minnesota community. As for our future, senior leaders and I pledge to be mindful at all times of the significant responsibility we have for ensuring the continued integrity of the University of Minnesota. With that, Madam Chair, I invite your questions and open conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kaler, for that presentation and for the thoughts that you brought up, and also Regent Allen for your comments. They're very much appreciated, and we know and want to thank you for being involved in that AGB report also. The administration has looked at the Free report and certainly discussed the lessons that we have learned, and the AGB report emphasizes many of those. I can assure you that I and our executive director and others on the board will be looking carefully at the AGB report also to make sure that we are following many of their suggestions. Now I would like to hear their comments or questions from members of the board. Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Kaler, for your comments and observations. I think that as we're listening to you and Regent Allen discuss this very important issue, I think for the 12 members of the board, what is our fiduciary legal responsibility to report? It appears that we look at Penn State, do not have the evidence, do not have all the details, certainly, that there was, let me simply call it a whisper campaign that was going on. Some people began to know, but decided we're not going to say anything. So my question is, and maybe it's legal counsel, what is our fiduciary and or legal responsibility as board members to report abuses against children or potentially students?
Madam Chair, I will take a stab at answering that question and ask Bill Donahue to provide to the degree he can off the top of his head a legal answer. My view on this is consistent with the notice that I sent to the University Committee at the very beginning of this uncovering of the issues at Penn State, and that is a simple one. These are violations of law. These aren't nuanced policy questions. These are heinous, illegal acts. Any one of us, officer of the university or a board member, has a duty and responsibility to report that to law enforcement immediately. And I think that legal requirement would supersede any regential obligations you might otherwise have. But I see General Counsel Rotenberg is in the room as well.
Can I make a comment?
Certainly. Well,
I understood the question was about legal, and General Counsel Rotenberg is going to answer that question, but I would like to suggest something else. It's also cultural. There was unfortunately, over a period of time, a culture was built up there, whether it was intended or not is irrelevant, that compromised the institution and compromised the victims. And having been part of large, complex organizations before, I know that culture drives behavior. And when everybody understands that it's their responsibility not only to report legal violations, but to report ethical violations promptly, and then there's close to zero tolerance on the part of the leadership of the institution for any of that. And once that culture is established and maintained, the likelihood of anything like this happening at an institution drops precipitously.
Good. General Counsel Rotenberg, I'm sure you have a comment to make about this and give us some counsel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regent Johnson's question, as I understand it, relates to the fiduciary responsibilities of the board related to the crimes that were committed at Penn State University. As President Kaler appropriately noted, these were at the time allegations and then determined to be crimes under the laws of the state of Pennsylvania. Minnesota has analogous criminal statutes, and so the simple answer, as President Kaler said, is anybody who's aware of this type of alleged criminal activity on our campus has to report it to law enforcement. And the training we conducted last fall is related directly to that obligation. There's a criminal law obligation to report in Minnesota those allegations of a nature that were similar at Penn State. Beyond that, your question relates to the fiduciary obligations of the board generally. Certainly, if individually you become aware of an allegation like that, you, like any other person, have an obligation to report it to law enforcement. But as a body, you have an array of fiduciary duties that are imposed and created by the Constitution of the state of Minnesota that incorporates your charter. You are generally responsible for the laws and the governance of this institution, and so you have fiduciary duties stemming from your charter responsibilities, and then an array of other state, federal, and regulatory obligations that are imposed on you. Specifically with respect to intercollegiate athletics, you have an obligation to maintain institutional control over the program. That phrase is deceptively simple, that it has a whole array of specific obligations associated with it, but that's the title of the obligation as relates to the athletic program and your obligations as part of the NCAA.
Are there other questions? Regent Broad.
Madam Chair, and I appreciate hearing about our compliance with the free report, even though it wasn't relative to our compliance. I think that's really important. Having said that, I think that there's a couple issues that I think are worthy of continued assessment by this board, and they're related but not directly related. And I think that when we put policies in place, and when the university broadly has policies in place, those policies and structures need to be based on what the structure needs, not personalities. And I think too often in organizations, decisions are made relative to what we think that person may or may not do. And so I appreciate learning that we have structures that are in place that are not personality based, and that no matter who sits in that spot, whether it's you sitting in that spot or whether it's somebody else sitting in that spot, the decisions and the accountability and the audit requirements and the interactions and checks and balances are in place no matter who sits there. And I think that is a structurally an important thing for a board to have a knowledge of. Also, when we think about our responsibilities as a member of a large board, I can only do with information when I get information. And in a very strong chair-driven board, and Madam Chair, this is of no reflection to you, in a strong chair-driven board, especially with legal issues surrounding a lot of issues, not everybody on the board has the same information. So from a board standpoint, I think it's important for our policies to demand, not just ask, but to demand of our leaders on the board in written form that information that is relevant to this university gets passed down in some way, shape, or form. And I just want to make sure that we have that demand on paper. And again, I trust you fully, Madam Chair, but you won't always be there. And I want to make sure that the structure is in place to have that demand and that assurance. I think it was Reagan who said, President Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. And I think that that's our role, is to trust, but to verify through the policies and the demands that we make of ourselves and our leaders, not just because we trust them, but because we expect that to be delivered, that information to be delivered downward on the board.
Yes. Very important comments, and that our policies need to reflect what's important and not personalities, because there is a lot of trust, I think, on this board, but that it's important that we also have it in writing and policy. Thank you for those comments. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Madam Chair and colleagues. I had a number of comments. Most of them have been addressed through the comments from the President and Regent Allen. Couple of major points. One is that I think the AGB report will be more useful in the long run than the free report, and I think we need to spend a fair amount of time, and maybe Mr. Brewitt and Mr. Teague and Mr. Rotenberg and other staff and the chair look at that and make sure we're getting the right amount of detail at the right settings with the right focus. I thought it was really a well-written report, and there are some areas in there that I don't think we're getting all the information on. Second takeaway I have is maybe Regent Allen, the President mentioned, is the word humble. And that is because our culture right now, remember the discussion we had last year about our culture being risk averse? That's the consequence of our own problems that we had wasn't that long ago, less than 20 years ago, but we're still fighting that. So it can happen anywhere. It can happen to us. It has happened to us in both athletics and in other areas. So humble is a good word as we dissect this very unfortunate situation at Penn State.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Other comments, questions? Regent Frobenius.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. Regent Beeson touched on the topic that I would like to comment on as well, and going back to the sort of lessons learned of this university in the past. This discussion has to be beyond the discussion of the child issues that have brought this thing to the forefront. We talked about, Regent Larson talked about the culture of compliance in an organization. We had an experience 20 years ago in which this university was informed in writing by federal officials that we had a culture of noncompliance. If I recall the actual words that were used in that. It's safe to raise that publicly here because none of us were in the boards at those times. Bless those souls that had to deal with that issue. But the university did put in a lot of change to do so, most of which and much of which still exists today, and it has got better in that process. But it just strikes me that we have to deal with a couple of assumptions. Number one, I think bad things will happen in the best organizations, no matter what occurs. It's just reality of the world we live in. Regent Broad talked about our need to trust and verify. I think the most important thing the board can do is to make sure that this compliance culture is reinforced by a combination of formal reporting mechanisms, regular reporting of informations. And quite frankly, I'm more interested in the process than I am the content. I just want to make sure that there is a process going on that's looking at issues that don't fall necessarily into the legal side, but occasionally fall into the ethical sides as well. And we're having a way of monitoring and supporting that evolving culture. This is a process that requires everybody to take a role. It gets excited now that this tragic event has occurred, has had enormous publicity about it. It's very important that we say, how do we improve our support of a culture of compliance at the University of Minnesota and not pat ourselves on the back just for the accomplishments that we may have achieved so far.
If I might.
Yes, President Kaler.
Thank you, Chair Cohen, Regent Frobenius. I completely endorse your comments, and I do believe that with the Audit Committee, chaired by Regent Beeson, we have a very robust conduit between the university and the board around all of these topics. And I know that that our auditor is keenly interested in both the process and financial audit aspects of her job, and our compliance officer is focused on really building that culture. Regent Broad, I think, used trust but verify, and we have a very manifest organization in which the vice presidents are our compliance partners, that there are individuals all through the organization who assist and do the work of compliance, organized through the compliance officer and our general counsel to bring elements and oversight and review to the board through the audit committee. So again, I am not foolish enough to claim that we're anywhere near perfect. It is a continuously improving operation, but the structures that are in place are robust.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions on this really important topic? If not, the work session is adjourned.
I'll be here in the morning, and there's going to be two. There's going to be during his president's remarks, first thing, and then the biennial budget. There'll be slides. It's agenda item number 7, I think it is. I will. I sent it to you electronically, but I'll have